Lean in close. I want to tell you a secret, one whispered across 2.5 million light-years, now thrumming beneath our very feet. It's not a story of the future, but of a present we're still struggling to grasp. Look up tonight. Those aren't just stars, they're echoes, ghosts of a sky that's slowly, beautifully, heartbreakingly transforming. Our galaxy, the comforting, familiar Milky Way, is already intertwined with Andromeda. Not a sudden, violent crash, but an ethereal, millennia-long embrace. We live in the cosmic pause, the slow inhalation before the universe exhales something entirely new. This isn't about destruction, not in the way you imagine. It's about a quiet, inescapable truth that has remade our understanding of permanence, purpose, and even solitude. Imagine a world where the very canvas of night is dissolving, not into darkness, but into another, alien tapestry. This is our reality, a gentle, sorrowful merging that challenges the deepest corners of what it means to simply be. The air in the old observatory carried the ghosts of ambition, a faint metallic tang of aging machinery mixed with the dust of decades, stirred only by the soft hum of cooling fans and the occasional, almost imperceptible creak of the massive dome overhead. Elara Vance knew these sounds as intimately as she knew the subtle shifts in the stellar nursery of the Orion Nebula or the quiet pulse of a distant quasar. Here, in the forgotten quiet of a Midwestern town, tucked between fields of whispering corn and streets that largely emptied after dusk, she spent her nights. Her town, Northwood, was a placid eddy in the grand currents of the world. Houses, neat and unpretentious, lined streets, named after trees that no longer stood. Life moved at a Sunday morning pace, concerned with harvest yields, school board meetings, and the gentle erosion of time on local businesses. The Northwood Astronomical Institute, affectionately, or perhaps ironically, called the Eye of Northwood, was a relic of an era when local philanthropists dreamt of cosmic revelation. Now it was repurposed rather than truly maintained. Its grand telescope, a behemoth of glass and steel, once capable of piercing the deepest reaches of the observable universe, now strained against the limitations of aging optics and an ever-shrinking budget. Elara was its lone guardian, its last devotee. An astrophysicist by trade, a philosopher by temperament, she had found her way to this quiet corner of the United States not by grand design, but by a gravitational pull she couldn't quite articulate. Perhaps it was the silence, the lack of city glow, the way the Milky Way used to arc across the velvet blackness with a boldness she rarely saw elsewhere. Or perhaps it was simply the universe nudging her towards a place where its most profound secret could be most clearly observed. Her work began when the sun dipped below the horizon, painting the sky in a final fiery elegy that she barely registered. Her world truly began with the first pinpricks of light, as the dome groaned open, revealing the inky canvas above. Tonight, like countless nights before, she settled into the worn ergonomic chair, her fingers finding the familiar cold of the control panel. The air was cool, almost damp, carrying the faint scent of rain from earlier in the day. The only light came from her glowing monitors, casting a pale, ethereal sheen on her face, highlighting the faint lines of fatigue around her eyes. He wasn't looking for discovery in the conventional sense. The grand, sweeping announcements of new planets or distant galaxies were no longer her pursuit. Elara was hunting ghosts. He was tracing the slow, deliberate dance of giants, a cosmic ballet that had been accelerating for decades, imperceptible to the hurried rhythms of human life, yet profoundly reshaping the very fabric of their sky. The soft collision, as it was quietly referred to in the dwindling, whispered circles of astrophysics, was no longer a theoretical projection. It was here. It was now. Through the scope, magnified by a century of optical engineering, the changes were subtle, yet undeniably disturbing. The familiar star fields, once meticulously charted and memorized, now possessed a disconcerting fluidity. What was once a static tapestry was becoming a living, breathing, shifting entity. She saw it in the faint, elongated halos around distant galaxies, no longer perfectly oval but subtly distended, like stretched reflections in a warped mirror. She saw it in the burgeoning population of blue giant stars in regions where, according to older star charts, only a quiet, ancient stellar dust had resided. These were not new stars being born within the Milky Way. They were interlopers, pioneers from Andromeda, venturing into the burgeoning frontier of their shared merging space. The most poignant evidence, the one that pricked at her soul with a quiet sorrow, was the Andromeda galaxy itself. No longer a distinct, slightly fuzzy oval, a grand lone neighbor in the cosmic void, it had begun to bleed into their own. Its spiral arms, once so clearly defined, now seemed to fray at the edges, tendrils of gas and dust reaching out, intertwining with the outer fringes of the Milky Way's own vast, luminous disk. It wasn't a violent embrace, not a catastrophic impact as some had once sensationalized. It was a slow, almost tender intermingling, like two colossal nebulae gently exchanging wisps of starlight and cosmic dust. Yet, in its gentleness lay its terrifying inevitability. For decades, the data had been accumulating, a quiet, insistent hum beneath the cacophony of human concerns. Doppler shifts, proper motions, photometric anomalies, all singing the same sorrowful song. The Andromeda galaxy was approaching, not head-on for a cataclysmic smash, but tangentially, a long, drawn-out kiss that would stretch over billions of years, slowly dissolving both into a single, grand elliptical galaxy. But the first, soft touches, the initial brush of stellar skirts, had already happened. Elara meticulously logged the data, her fingers moving with a practiced, almost ritualistic grace. Each measurement, each spectral analysis, was a confirmation of a truth few wanted to acknowledge, let alone comprehend. The light from those newly arrived stars, those spectral echoes from a galaxy that was now part of theirs, told a story of permanence dissolving. The concept of our galaxy was becoming an anachronism. The canvas of night was no longer fixed. It was a living, evolving organism, shedding its old skin, growing something new and terrifyingly beautiful. "You see it too, don't you?" she whispered into the cool, silent air of the observatory, as if speaking to the universe itself, or perhaps to the ghost of the telescope's original designer. The quiet blurring, the gentle, heartbreaking loss of definition. Her solitude in the observatory, surrounded by the hum of machinery and the vast, indifferent expanse of space, was profound. It wasn't a lonely solitude, not precisely, but a heavy one, burdened by knowledge. She was a witness to a cosmic metamorphosis, a transformation that challenged the very foundations of human identity and belonging. How could one feel rooted when the very ground beneath one's feet, metaphorically speaking, was slowly merging with an alien landscape? The dystopia wasn't in fire and ruin, but in this quiet, almost elegiac surrender. It was in the world's gentle shrug of indifference, in the way a cosmic event of such magnitude was relegated to the fringes, a whisper in the dark, while the daily grind of taxes and trivialities consumed the waking hours. It was in the struggle of institutions like the Eye of Northwood, starved for the very resources that could help humanity grasp its new reality. Elara Vance, an astrophysicist in a quiet Midwestern town, was a keeper of the universe's most beautiful, most devastating secret. And with every passing night, as Andromeda bled a little further into the Milky Way, she felt the truth thrumming not just beneath her feet, but deep within her very bones, reshaping not just the sky, but the definition of what it meant to simply she. The world began to soften at the edges. Not with a bang, not even with a whimper, but with the quiet, persistent brush of something infinitesimally small, unimaginably distant. It started in the upper atmosphere, a shimmer that wasn't quite a mirage, a deepening of the sky's blue that felt less like dawn and more like a bruise, blooming across the celestial canvas. Then came the reds, deeper than any sunset, staining the western horizon with an alien sorrow, as if the sun itself was weeping particulate tears. Elara had noticed it first in the data, long before the sky started to tell its own truth. The spectral analysis graphs, usually so stark and predictable, had begun to show anomalies, subtle peaks in regions that should have been silent, whispers in the cosmic background noise. She had tried to explain it, to quantify the unprecedented gentle contamination, but the numbers felt too cold for the warmth of the melancholy light now bathing the world. She lived in a quiet corner of what used to be a bustling city, now hollowed out by a shared unspoken weariness. Her apartment, high above the muted street, offered a panoramic view of the changing sky. Tonight, it was a tapestry woven from faded rose and bruised violet, each shade imbued with a strange metallic sheen, as if tiny invisible motes were catching and scattering the light in ways no terrestrial dust ever could. This was the dusting. Not a storm of debris, but a celestial snowfall, so fine it was almost imperceptible to the naked eye, yet potent enough to rewrite the very atmosphere. The particles, Elara knew, were fragments, microscopic motes of interstellar gas, stellar dust, and nebular remnants, flung out from the heart of Andromeda's vast, swirling embrace, now drifting through the colossal void to find an unexpected home. They were the first tangible emissaries of a merger already in progress, not a violent impact, but a slow, deliberate interweaving of cosmic threads. Their arrival on Earth was less an invasion and more a quiet settling, like fine powder settling on old photographs. Society, already fragile, had absorbed this new reality with a muted, weary resignation. There were no riots in the streets, no grand proclamations of impending doom. How could there be when the doom was a shift in the quality of light? People simply looked up, sighed, and went about their routines, their shoulders a little more slumped, their gazes a little more distant. The morning commute, under the eerie, softened glow, felt like a procession of ghosts. Conversations often drifted to the sky, then evaporated into silence. Odd color today, isn't it? Someone might murmur, and another would simply nod, a tired acknowledgement of a shared unfixable strangeness. Official reports, of course, were a masterclass in obfuscation. Atmospheric refraction event. Increased particulate matter of undetermined origin. Minor spectroscopic variances. The language was clinical, designed to soothe, to minimize, to downplay. They spoke of naturally occurring phenomena, of recalibrations of atmospheric models, always with an underlying tone that suggested everything was perfectly normal, or at least perfectly manageable. The news anchors, their faces bathed in the peculiar new light of their studios, would deliver these reassurances with practiced serenity, a gentle, almost apologetic smile playing on their lips. They offered scientific-sounding explanations about changes in solar flares or volcanic emissions, grasping at any earthbound cause to avoid the terrifying, beautiful truth. Ilara often watched these broadcasts, a faint, almost imperceptible tremor running through her. She understood the need for calm, the fragile psychological state of a populace already burdened by so many other quiet losses. But her eyes, trained by years of peering into the vastness, saw past the carefully crafted word. Her instruments, unblinking and unbiased, told a different story. Her workstation was a sanctuary, a cave of glowing screens and humming machinery. Lines of code scrolled down one monitor, charting the precise concentrations of silicate spherules and carbonaceous chondrites, now exhibiting an isotopic signature that was undeniably extragalactic. Another screen displayed real-time atmospheric sampling, tracing the microscopic cosmic dust as it drifted down, layer by invisible layer. She ran the simulations again, as she did every night. The models showed the elegant, terrifying truth. The Andromeda particles were not just settling on Earth. They were integrating I with it. They mingled with terrestrial dust, became part of the rain, were carried on the wind. They permeated the air everyone breathed, the water everyone drank. This wasn't contamination in the sense of a pollutant, but an absorption, a gentle, pervasive remixing of fundamental matter. The very fabric of their world was being subtly, exquisitely rewritten by the slow-motion collision. One particularly poignant graph showed the increasing luminosity of the night sky, not from light pollution, but from the scattering effect of Andromeda's dust. The stars, once sharp pinpricks in an inky blackness, were now diffused, softened, like pearls seen through fine gauze. It was beautiful, in a way, like a faded memory, but it was also a profound erasure. The Milky Way, their ancestral sky, was dissolving into this new hybrid celestial expanse. Ilara leaned back in her chair, the cool hum of the servers a balm against the quiet ache in her chest. She remembered her grandmother, eyes bright with wonder, pointing out constellations, telling stories of ancient heroes etched against the infinite black. Now those heroes were being obscured, their narratives overwritten by a cosmic truth too vast for human stories. The thought brought a whisper of sorrow. What did it mean to be home, when home itself was changing at its most fundamental level? When the air in your lungs carried the breath of another galaxy? When the light that touched your skin had traveled 2.5 million light-years, not just to you, but through the remnants of another cosmic titan? It wasn't a violent assault, but a quiet, almost tender dissolution. The universe, in its indifferent grandeur, was simply doing what it always did, rearranging itself. And humanity, with its brief, flickering consciousness, was merely a silent witness, caught in the cosmic pause, breathing in the dust of a merging future. The dystopian dread wasn't in the fear of what was coming, but in the quiet, heartbreaking realization that it was already here, woven into the very light, inescapable, and irrevocably altering the meaning of permanence. She looked out her window again, watching the strange, purpling twilight deepen. The official reports would continue to downplay it. Society would continue its weary resignation. But Ilara knew. She saw the data. She felt the subtle shift in the air, a silent thrum that resonated not just in the scientific instruments, but in the deepest, most vulnerable corners of her own soul. The stars weren't just echoes anymore. They were a quiet, insistent hum, signaling the gentle, sorrowful merging that had already begun. Right here, beneath their strangely altered sky. Elara had always found solace in the steadfastness of the stars, a constancy that now felt like a cruel, fading memory. Lately, a certain unease had begun to ripple through the quiet corners of the scientific world, a tremor barely perceptible to the rushing currents of daily life, yet acutely felt by those who spent their nights gazing skyward. It began subtly, like a shift in the wind's direction that only migratory birds could truly discern. The first whispers came from the deep space navigation log. Anomalies, minor deviations in expected stellar positions used for triangulation. Nothing catastrophic, no probe veering wildly off course, but enough to trigger cautious recalibrations, enough to raise an eyebrow in the sterile hush of mission control rooms. A star that should have been precisely there was instead a hair's breadth to the left, or its intensity ever so slightly off. For centuries, these celestial markers had been the unwavering anchors of our journey into the void, and now they were shimmering, as if the very fabric of the cosmic map was softly crinkling. Then there were the migratory patterns. Across continents, ancient routes seemed to fray. Swallows arrived in European villages weeks later than customary, their slender wings beating against an unfamiliar air. Salmon, navigating by unseen magnetic currents and perhaps the subtle filters of the sun and stars through water, found themselves disoriented, some populations turning back, others venturing into uncharted spawning grounds. It wasn't chaos, not yet, but a pervasive, sorrowful confusion. Farmers in Kansas spoke of monarch butterflies, usually a predictable orange river across their fields, now fluttering aimlessly, sometimes simply settling where they landed, as if the destination had been erased from their ancient, delicate memories. The world hummed with a quiet bewilderment, an undercurrent of something wrong that most dismissed as climate change, or simply nature being nature. But Elara knew better. She felt it too, a low thrum beneath her feet, a resonance with the sky that had somehow deepened. As she packed her minimal bag for Washington, D.C., the air outside her apartment window felt heavier, cooler, despite the rising spring sun. The conference invitation had been understated, cosmic flux and terrestrial implications. An academic euphemism for a truth too vast, too uncontainable, to be spoken aloud without fear of sounding mad. The train ride from Philadelphia was a blur of muted landscapes, the rolling hills and budding trees passing by like scenes from a dream. Elara watched the telephone poles flash past, a linear progression, a symbol of human order against the boundless, now shifting, cosmos. She wondered if the engineers who laid these tracks, who strung these wires, had ever considered a universe that might not stay neatly within its predicted bounds. Washington, D.C., usually bustling with its particular brand of purposeful energy, felt subdued. The cherry blossoms, still holding onto their fragile pink, seemed to droop under an invisible weight. The air was thick with the scent of burgeoning spring and something else, a quiet anxiety, like static electricity before a storm. The conference was held in an unassuming historic building not far from the Smithsonian, its red brick facade whispering tales of human endeavor and discovery. Inside, the hushed grandeur of polished wood and worn velvet chairs felt ironically small, almost fragile, in the face of what they were there to discuss. The attendees were a collection of astrophysicists, cosmologists, ornithologists, marine biologists, and even a few cultural anthropologists, all specialists, now bound by a shared, unsettling phenomenon. They spoke in low tones, their greetings brief, their eyes holding a particular, knowing melancholy. The buzz of anticipation that usually animated such gatherings was absent, replaced by a quiet solemnity like mourners at a wake. Elara found her seat near the back, observing the subtle choreography of shared dread. On the screen, the first presenter, a tall, gaunt man with tired eyes from JPL, clicked through slides of data. He spoke of minor orbital perturbations in deep space probes, of star trackers needing unprecedented recalibrations. His voice, though calm, held a tremor that betrayed the casual scientific language. He didn't mention Andromeda by name, not yet. But everyone in the room knew. They saw the faint, ghostly streaks on his star charts, not the perfect pinpoint light they should have been. It wasn't an error in their instruments, he concluded, his voice barely audible, but a shift in the observed positions of certain distant, fixed objects. He didn't need to elaborate. The implication hung heavy in the air. The fixed objects weren't as fixed as once believed. Next, a soft-spoken woman from the National Audubon Society presented charts detailing anomalous bird migration. She spoke of increased disorientation, of flocks splitting, of species appearing in areas never before recorded. "It's as if their internal compasses," she murmured, "are being pulled in multiple directions at once, or the magnetic field lines they rely on are rippling." She showed a map of altered flight paths, lines veering, crisscrossing, creating a tangled web where once there was elegant precision. The image was a poignant visual metaphor for their own intellectual disarray. Elara felt a cold knot tighten in her stomach. It was one thing to read about theoretical galactic collisions, another entirely to see it manifest in the bewildered flight of a songbird. This wasn't some distant, abstract cosmic event. It was already here, woven into the very fabric of Earth's life, a silent, sorrowful intrusion. The true gravity of the situation was laid bare in the afternoon session. A panel of 5 eminent scientists sat before them, their faces etched with a profound weariness. One of them, Dr. Aris Thorne, a Nobel laureate whose theories Elara had devoured in graduate school, spoke first. His voice was a raspy whisper, amplified by the microphone, yet still fragile. "We have always understood the universe as a grand, predictable machine," he began, his gaze sweeping over the silent room. "Our models, our laws, were built upon the assumption of its fundamental, immutable order. But what we are witnessing now, it is an unwriting of that order. Not a violent tear, but a slow, gentle dissolution." He paused, a long, heavy silence descending. The gravitational embrace of Andromeda is not some distant future event. It is happening now. Our galaxy, our home, is already intertwined. The subtle shifts. His words were not sensationalized. They were delivered with a quiet, devastating honesty. There was no talk of solutions, no proposed countermeasures. Only acknowledgement. Shared anxiety thickened the air, a palpable wave of helplessness. These were the brightest minds, the vanguard of human knowledge, yet they sat, hunched and defeated, before a force so immense, so indifferent, that their brilliance amounted to nothing more than the ability to observe their own impending, slow-motion erasure. Elara saw it in the way Dr. Thorne's hands trembled slightly as he gripped the podium, in the downcast eyes of his fellow panelists, in the collective, silent intake of breath from the audience. This wasn't a problem to be solved. It was a truth to be endured. They were witnessing the slow, beautiful, heartbreaking transformation of everything they knew, and all they could do was document its coming. As the session ended, a quiet exodus began. No lively debates, no networking chatter, just the soft shuffle of feet and the occasional, strained cough. Elara walked out into the cool DC air, feeling a profound, aching solitude. She looked up at the sky, a pale blue vault that still seemed innocent, unaware of the profound metamorphosis taking place within its depths. She knew, though, that tonight, those wouldn't just be stars. They would be echoes, ghost lights from a sky that was slowly, beautifully, heartbreakingly transforming. A new tapestry was unfolding, stitch by agonizing stitch, and she and all of humanity were merely threads caught in its making. The universe wasn't ending with a bang, but with a sorrowful, unending whisper. The air had always hummed with it, even before the telescopes confirmed, even before the models simulated, even before the scientists, with their grave, quiet voices, began to speak of inevitability. It was a tension, a thrumming chord just beyond human hearing, a premonition that settled in the hollows of the ribs. We lived in the cosmic pause, as the opening hook described. But pauses are deceptive. They imply stillness, yet they are often the most potent moments of gathering force, the breath held before the world changes. We had held ours for so long, collectively, unconsciously, that the very act of existing felt like a quiet vigil. Then, the whispers began to coalesce. Not human whispers, but the universe's own. For months, the most powerful observatories had reported anomalies, faint light patterns, subtle shifts in spectral lines that weren't quite right. Like an errant brushstroke on a masterpiece that only the most discerning eye could catch. These were the tendrils, the phantom limbs of a galaxy 2.5 million light-years away, reaching out, not in aggression, but in an ancient gravitational pull that defied our human notions of distance and time. The scientific community spoke of first contact in hushed, reverent tones, not of aliens, but of an alien sky, an impending, ethereal invasion of light. And then, one summer night, it simply Vusask. It wasn't a sudden, cataclysmic burst, no trumpet fanfare or fiery herald. It was far more insidious, far more beautiful, and therefore far more profoundly unsettling. Maria, a librarian in her late 60s, noticed it first, not through any instrument, but with the quiet wisdom of a soul accustomed to observing the world without expectation. She sat on her porch, as she always did, sipping cold tea, watching the familiar arc of the Milky Way, a river of diamond dust spilled across velvet. But tonight, there was something else. Above the distinct, comforting band of our home galaxy, a new luminescence was emerging. It was so faint, so delicate, it could almost be mistaken for an optical illusion, a trick of the exhausted eye. A shimmering milky veil, thinner than gossamer, stretched across the inky canvas. It wasn't bright. In fact, it seemed to absorb light as much as reflect it, creating an almost negative space, a shadow glow. It was an ethereal, translucent sheet, ghost white and barely perceptible, like a forgotten breath caught in the cold night air. This was Andromeda. It wasn't a point of light or a cluster or even a recognizable spiral. It was just there, a vast, nebulous stretch, subtly distorting the familiar patterns of the constellations, like a sheer curtain drawn over a beloved painting. It draped itself over the upper reaches of the Milky Way, not obscuring it entirely, but subtly altering its presence, making it feel less singular, less uniquely ours. Maria felt a chill that had nothing to do with the evening breeze. It was the sensation of a boundary dissolving, of the infinite suddenly becoming just a little less distant, a little less abstract. She simply sat there, staring, a single tear tracing a path down her wrinkled cheek, not of sorrow, but of an overwhelming, quiet awe. She wasn't alone. Across the United States, in quiet suburban backyards, on empty city rooftops, on lonely stretches of highway, countless others were looking up. They stood frozen, their breath catching in their throats, their hearts thrumming with a shared, unspoken recognition. There were no shouts of panic, no pointing fingers of fear. Instead, there was a collective, profound silence, a deeper hush than any night had ever known. Humanity, for a fleeting, terrifyingly beautiful moment, was united in a single, introspective gaze. The news channels, usually ablaze with manufactured crises, offered hushed, respectful reports. Scientists, their voices tinged with a blend of professional triumph and personal melancholy, spoke not of catastrophe, but of transformation. They called it the Andromeda Veil, or sometimes, more poetically, the first whisper. They explained the physics, the millions of light years compressed into this single, visible, undeniable truth. But the words felt inadequate, hollow against the visceral reality shimmering above. What could you say, after all, when your very sky betrayed its singularity? The existential weight of it settled over everything, quiet and pervasive. It was the truth that had always been lurking, the unsaid pronouncement in the opening hook. Our galaxy, the comforting, familiar Milky Way, is already intertwined with Andromeda. Now, it was etched across the night, not in fire, but in fragile light. The Milky Way was no longer a solitary island, a cosmic home distinct and inviolable. It was now part of something larger, something foreign, something that demanded a complete reevaluation of what home truly meant. For generations, humanity had looked up at the stars and felt a sense of both boundless possibility and profound isolation. The vastness was both a prison and a promise. Now that isolation was being subtly breached. We were not alone in the void. We were merely part of a larger, slower, more majestic dance. But with that newfound connection came a profound sense of loss, the loss of our distinct cosmic identity. Our star map was no longer solely ours. It was becoming a collaborative piece, a tapestry woven with threads from another, ancient loom. This wasn't the kind of dystopia envisioned in most nightmares. No sudden wars, no resource depletion, no tyrannical overlord. This was a quiet dystopia of the spirit, a world where the very canvas of reality had begun to dissolve, not into darkness, but into another, alien tapestry, as the hook suggested. It chipped away at the foundations of human certainty, not with a hammer, but with the gentle, persistent erosion of cosmic truth. Why strive for earthly power when the very heavens were redrawing their boundaries? Why squabble over borders when your galactic home was merging with another? The initial shock gave way to a pervasive, melancholic wonder. People still went to work, still bought groceries, still raised their children. But everything was underscored by the Andromeda Veil. Conversations drifted, inevitably, to the sky. Old arguments seemed petty, old ambitions hollow. There was a quiet resignation, not to defeat, but to an inevitability so vast it rendered human will almost meaningless. We were spectators to our own cosmic transformation, passive participants in a grand slow-motion ballet. Even the concept of night seemed to change. It was no longer just the absence of the sun, but a moment of communion, a silent gathering beneath the twin presences of two interweaving galaxies. Sleep became harder for some, easier for others, a deeper surrender to the vastness. Dreams took on new dimensions, infused with the shimmering ghostly light of Andromeda. Artists painted it, musicians composed for it, poets wrestled with its profound implications. It was a new muse, a new burden, a new lens through which to view a fading past and an uncertain future. The United States, with its sprawling landscapes and diverse peoples, reacted with a quiet, decentralized grace. There were no mass hysteria events, no government-mandated sky-gazing sessions. Instead, individuals simply found themselves drawn to windows, to porches, to open fields, to witness this unfolding. Small groups would gather, not to converse loudly, but to stand in companionable silence, sharing the heavy, beautiful weight of the moment. They shared mugs of coffee, or a bottle of whiskey, or simply the cool night air, united by the shimmering, undeniable proof that their world, their universe, was forever changed. The Milky Way, our ancient familiar home, was no longer singular. It had begun its millennia-long embrace. And as the Andromeda veil stretched further, deepening its subtle glow, humanity looked up, not in fear, but with a profound, aching understanding. The cosmic pause was over. The universe had begun its slow, sorrowful exhale, birthing something entirely new. And we, the tiny inhabitants of a merging world, could only watch and whisper and wonder. The sky had become a tapestry of two dreams. Lean in close, and you might hear the faint hum of it, a frequency too low for human ears, yet felt in the very marrow. Andromeda, once a distant, fuzzy smudge, now hung like a shimmering, inverted twin, a ghost-white nebula spilling across the familiar azure, even visible in the daylight hours, though it truly came alive after dusk. It wasn't an invading force, not a sudden cataclysm, but a slow, graceful interweaving, a dance of cosmic currents. Yet, this celestial intimacy had pulled humanity's gaze inward, turning the vast expanse above into a mirror. The grand questions that once only troubled philosophers now echoed in the quiet corners of every small town, in every whispered conversation. In their wake, a peculiar kind of art bloomed, delicate and profound, like moss on ancient stones. Galleries, once filled with vibrant, urgent expressions of human striving, now displayed canvases of muted grays and blues, depicting infinite voids and nebulous forms, or abstract works that spoke of connection and dissolution. Poets, their voices softened to near silence, penned verses that pondered the very nature of each being, in a universe that refused to hold still. Philosophical movements, not of grand manifestos but of quiet, online forums and hushed, lamplit gatherings, wrestled with the sudden, unsettling truth. If galaxies could merge, if the very fabric of the night sky could be rewritten over millennia, what then of human permanence? What was the purpose of a fleeting life, a fragile species, against such an oceanic, indifferent, yet strangely beautiful transformation? The old anchors, faith, progress, individual achievement, seemed to drift, untethered, in this new cosmic tide. Ilara felt it most acutely in the long, drawn-out evenings in her small town of Havenwood, nestled deep in the quiet heartland. The double glow in the sky meant streetlights often seemed redundant, casting strange, elongated shadows that danced with the light from the merging galaxies. She found solace, a grounding ritual, in the dusty warmth of her old vinyl records. The crackle of the needle dropping onto worn grooves was a comfort, a finite, predictable sound in a world that had shed its previous certainties. She'd inherited her father's collection, obscure folk singers from the 70s, jazz that flowed like liquid moonlight, classical pieces heavy with an almost unbearable longing. Each rotation of the turntable was a quiet act of rebellion against the swirling, formless future, a reaffirmation of the past's tangible beauty. She'd spend hours in her small living room, the muted light of Andromeda filtering through the window, painting the room in shades of pearlescent gray. A record would play, its melancholic melody weaving through the silence, and Alara would simply, "Hi, Bay." She watched the dust motes dance in the faint light, a miniature galaxy of their own, and allowed the music to carry her, not away, but deeper into herself. This new sky, this cosmic embrace, had made everything else seem too loud, too insistent. Only the whispers of old music, the quiet contemplation, seemed to resonate with the universe's new hushed rhythm. Heavenwood, like Alara herself, was coping in its own quiet way. The town square, once a bustling hub, now hosted impromptu, silent gatherings where people would simply sit on benches, heads tilted upwards, sharing a profound, unspoken communion under the twin skies. The town's lone church, usually a bastion of comforting routine, now held sermons that skirted around traditional dogma, instead focusing on themes of cosmic humility, the search for meaning in interconnectedness, and the ephemeral nature of all things. Pastor Davies, a man whose booming voice had once filled the nave, now spoke in a softer, almost reverent tone, his eyes often drifting towards the stained glass window, where the blue of the sky now held a faint, otherworldly shimmer. The general store, still run by the gruff but kind Mr. Henderson, saw fewer customers buying frivolous trinkets and more seeking practical necessities, or simply lingering to share a moment of quiet reflection. Perhaps children, once boisterous, now played quieter games, often gazing upwards, pointing at the wisps of Andromeda, inventing new constellations in its swirling arms. There was a pervasive sense of shared vulnerability, a subtle, underlying sadness that seemed to bind them all, yet also a strange, quiet dignity in their collective silence. They were all witnesses, caught in the slow, inevitable ballet of giants. It was amidst this gentle, pervasive melancholy that Alara found herself drawn to the sparse academic musings of Dr. R.S. Thorne. His essays, published on obscure online journals and in niche philosophical digests, stood out from the hopeful or panicked rhetoric that often flooded the mainstream. Thorne, a cosmologist who had once been celebrated for his bold theories on galactic formation, now wrote with a profound, almost weary resignation. He spoke not of scientific breakthroughs, but of the limitations of human understanding, of the crushing weight of cosmic time. His words were a balm to Alara, articulating the nameless dread and the strange, quiet awe that gnawed at her. One evening, after reading his latest piece, a lyrical, yet heartbreaking, exploration of how the merging challenged the very concept of a singular, stable universe, Alara felt an urge she couldn't ignore. She drafted an email, hesitant at first, then more determined. It was a simple message, a quiet reflection on his words, a shared sense of the unraveling he described. She didn't expect a reply. Who was she? A quiet observer in a small town, to engage with a man of his stature. A week later, a notification chimed. It was from him. His reply was brief, almost curt, yet laced with an unexpected vulnerability. "It's a relief," he wrote. "Oh no, that someone out there still sees the silence for what it is. Most prefer the noise," he signed off as Aris. That was the beginning. Their correspondence became a lifeline, a thread spun between two distant points in a universe that was slowly becoming one. Alara, hesitant at first, found her voice, asking questions that felt too vast for her small living room. She wrote of the vinyl records, of the quiet way Heavenwood was adapting, of the strange beauty of the twin sky. Aris, in turn, shared fragments of his own disillusionment. He spoke of his former colleagues, some clinging to outdated models, others retreating into silence, unable to reconcile their life's work with this new, profound truth. "We built our cathedrals of certainty," he once wrote. "I and the universe, in its gentle indifference, simply showed us a new, infinitely larger sky." He had once believed in the grand narrative of scientific progress, in the eventual triumph of human intellect over cosmic mystery. Now, he seemed to view the merging of galaxies not as a problem to be solved, but as an existential poem, one that rendered most scientific inquiry, at least in its traditional form, almost quaint. His disillusionment wasn't bitter, but rather a quiet, profound sadness, a lament for a truth he had sought his whole life, only to find it in a form that stripped away his purpose. He was a cartographer whose maps had suddenly been rendered obsolete, not by error, but by the very landscape changing beneath his feet. Their letters, exchanged over the slow, languid weeks, became a sanctuary. They talked not of facts, but of feelings, of the ache in the human soul when faced with the infinite. Ilara wrote of the feeling of being small, yet paradoxically, immensely connected. Eris wrote of the solitude inherent in such vastness, a solitude that even galactic merging could not fully dissolve. He still saw the stars, but differently now. Not as isolated points of light, but as the first, faint brushstrokes of a masterpiece whose canvas was still being prepared, a masterpiece that would unfold over eons, long after humanity's own brief candle had guttered out. And in that quiet exchange, Ilara felt a different kind of solace, not just from the past in her records, but in the present, in the shared, whispered understanding of a reality that was both beautiful and profoundly, irrevocably sad. "Lean in closer still. The secret I told you," the one whispered across the void, "has begun to bloom into something visible, something undeniably present. It started subtly, like the first faint breath of winter on a summer evening, then gained an insidious momentum. They call them the ghost lights now. Not with scientific rigor, not with the sterile nomenclature of discovery, but with the hushed reverence of those who witness a haunting. At first, they were rare, almost imperceptible. A flicker in the upper atmosphere, a transient brushstroke of something iridescent against the deepening twilight, dismissed as unusual solar flares or atmospheric anomalies. But as the cosmic embrace tightened, as the invisible currents of two titanic structures began their slow, graceful dance, the ghost lights multiplied. They were shimmering, slow-moving auroras, born not of our sun's fierce exhalations, but from the fragile ethereal detritus of two colliding galaxies. Cosmic dust, long-traveled and alien, meeting our familiar ionosphere. Energy fields, previously thought discrete, now intermingling, weaving tapestries of light unlike anything ever recorded in human history. They hung in the night sky, vast, silent canvases, unfurling without warning. Sometimes they were sheets of impossible violet, bleeding into shades of rose and emerald, slow dancing across the zenith. Other nights, they manifested as shimmering tendrils, like cosmic jellyfish drifting through an invisible ocean, their bioluminescence a testament to distances beyond comprehension. They moved with an unsettling languor, as if powered by a will infinitely patient, infinitely ancient. You could watch a single ribbon of light drift from one horizon to the next over the course of hours, its silent procession a counterpoint to the hurried rhythms of our lives below. For many, they became a source of quiet wonder, a nightly spectacle that pulled them from their screens and into the cool, silent observation of the heavens. Porches that had stood empty for years now hosted families wrapped in blankets, gazes fixed upwards, a shared silent awe binding them. There was a fragile beauty to it, a melancholic splendor in seeing something so utterly new, so utterly grand. Yet this wonder was perpetually tinged with an eerie undertone. The lights were a constant visual reminder of dissolving boundaries. Not just the boundaries between galaxies, but between what we knew and what we couldn't comprehend, between the secure certainty of our sky and the alien tapestry now being woven across it. The comfort of the familiar Milky Way, our celestial home, was slowly, gracefully, being overwritten by something else. The stars themselves seemed dimmer, muted by the vibrant, ghostly intrusion. It was a beautiful sadness, a quiet elegy to the sky we had lost, even as we gained this breathtaking, unsettling new one. Elara had felt this quiet sadness more acutely than most. Her small apartment, overlooking the hushed suburbs of a sprawling Arizona city, had become her observatory. She wasn't a professional astronomer, not in the traditional sense. Her background was in theoretical physics, but her true passion lay in the philosophical implications of grand cosmic events. She had been one of the first to theorize the nature of these nascent atmospheric phenomena, long before they had a name, long before they became commonplace. She called them interstitial resonances in her unpublished papers, echoes of the galactic interface bleeding into our reality. Now, with a modest grant and an insatiable curiosity, Elara spent her nights not just observing, but feeling the ghost lights. Her equipment was a blend of the advanced and the almost anachronistic. High-resolution, low-light cameras designed to capture the subtlest shifts in spectra, alongside ancient, wide-field telescopes, through which she simply looked, allowing the raw light to wash over. Her data logs weren't just numerical readouts. They were interspersed with lyrical prose, with questions penned in elegant script. What does it mean to witness the dismantling of your universe's scaffolding? What becomes of the concept of home when home itself is undergoing such profound transformation? He found elements in the ghost lights that were foreign, undeniably alien. The spectral signatures often deviated from anything known in our solar system, exhibiting unusual energy levels and particulate compositions that suggested their origin lay truly beyond our galactic arm. There were frequencies she detected that resonated with no known terrestrial or solar systemic phenomenon, a kind of cosmic hum that vibrated just at the edge of human perception. It was like listening to a language never before heard, a syntax woven from nebulae and dark matter. Yet, interwoven with this strangeness, there was something familiar, profoundly, disturbingly familiar. Sometimes, in the quiet hours just before dawn, as a particularly vibrant aurora would fade to a whisper of light, Elara would feel a strange, almost primordial recognition stir within her. There were patterns in their flow, in the way the energy fields interacted, that mirrored not just the known physics of our universe, but something deeper, more archetypal. She saw echoes of fractal geometry, of biological growth patterns, even of the synaptic firings within a human brain, simplified, magnified, writ large across the heavens. It wasn't a direct match, but a resonance, a harmonic. One night, as a particularly intense ghost light pulsed with an almost rhythmic beat, a slow, gentle expansion and contraction of luminous gas, Elara found herself tracing its movements on her star chart, not with a stylus, but with a finger. And then she saw it. Not a specific constellation, not a planetary alignment, but a shape, a faint, almost imperceptible outline within the aurora's shifting form that mirrored the double helix of DNA. It was fleeting, a pareidolik ghost perhaps, but it struck her with an almost physical force. She spent weeks running simulations, cross-referencing astronomical data with biological morphology, searching for the impossible connection. Was it simply a trick of the light, a subconscious projection of her own understanding onto the unknown? Or was there a deeper truth unfolding, a cosmic architecture that echoed life itself, not just on Earth, but across the vast, intermingling expanse of two galaxies? The thought was both exhilarating and terrifying. It suggested a profound interconnectedness, a universal grammar of existence, but also implied that our understanding of life, of sentience, of each being, was infinitesimally small, a single whispered word in a universe-sized poem. The ghost lights were more than just a phenomenon to Alara. They were a mirror. They reflected the vastness of the cosmos back onto the fragility of human understanding. They were beautiful, yes, but their beauty carried the weight of an imminent, inescapable change. Every shimmering pulse, every slow drift, every new hue was a gentle reminder that the sky was no longer just yours. It was becoming a shared canvas, dissolving the comfortable illusion of our solitary existence. And as Alara watched, notebook in hand, the lines of inquiry blurring with lines of poetry, she felt a profound sense of melancholy, a quiet sorrow for the sky we once knew, and a deepening, unsettling wonder for the immense alien beauty. We were not merely observers of a collision. We were living within its slow, luminous embrace, breathing the dust of a merging universe. The hum wasn't just in the air anymore. It was in the bone. A low, persistent thrumming that Alara sometimes felt in her teeth, other times like a pressure behind her eyes, always present. It wasn't a sound, not exactly, but a resonance, a frequency shift in the very fabric of existence. She'd wake with it, walk with it, and lie down with it, a constant companion to the deepening twilight that now seeped into midday. Lean in close, and you could hear it in the silence between people. The universe, in its slow, gentle collision, wasn't just remaking the sky. It was reaching inward, unfurling new landscapes within the human mind. People had begun to change, not with a sudden dramatic snap, but with the quiet, inexorable shift of tectonic plates. There was Mrs. Albright, her next-door neighbor, who used to prune her rose bushes with the precision of a surgeon. Now, Alara would catch her in the backyard, simply standing, gazing up at the faint, shimmering gauze that was once the Milky Way, replaced by the ghost of Andromeda. Mrs. Albright spoke in hushed tones of a feeling, a knowing that everything was connected, that the boundaries between her own skin and the farthest star were dissolving. Her eyes held a distant, almost beatific glow, but it was a cold glow, devoid of the warmth of human connection. When Alara tried to speak of community garden plans, Mrs. Albright would just nod slowly, murmuring about the cosmic dance, the great breath of the universe, and the futility of human endeavor. It wasn't madness, not in the screaming, thrashing sense. It was a profound, quiet surrender, a cosmic connection that absorbed all other attachments. Then there was Liam, her old college friend, who'd been an architect, obsessed with the sturdy foundations and clean lines that defined human achievement. He'd called her last week, his voice a flat monotone. "What's the point, Alara? To build something that will ultimately merge, dissolve, become part of another structure? Our ambitions are just temporary patterns in an infinite, unknowable tapestry." He'd quit his firm, stopped answering calls, his carefully constructed life crumbling not into chaos, but into a profound, suffocating apathy. He wasn't depressed, not in the way doctors understood it. There was no sadness, no despair, just an utter lack of concern for anything. He merely wasn't, a sentient anchor drifting in an ocean of indifference. Ilara saw the existential dread in others too, though it manifested more subtly than Liam's apathy. It wasn't the panic of an impending disaster, but the gnawing unease of an identity lost, a purpose undone. People still went to work, mostly, still bought groceries, still paid bills. But the light in their eyes had dimmed. Conversations became fractured, punctuated by long, uncomfortable silences, where the weight of the universe settled heavy on every unspoken word. They would talk about the weather, about mundane tasks, but never about dreams, never about the future. Because what future was there truly, when the very cosmos was telling them that permanence was an illusion, and the familiar was slated for a slow, beautiful obliteration? It was a quiet, societal fragmentation. Not riots in the streets, but a slow unraveling from within. Neighborhood potlucks dwindled. Sports leagues saw fewer participants. Community centers stood emptier. The threads that wove people together were fraying, not snapped by conflict, but dissolving under the quiet acid of meaninglessness. Couples who had once shared a vibrant life now moved like polite strangers in the same house, each adrift on their own ocean of cosmic dread or apathy. Children, strangely, seemed less affected, their minds perhaps more fluid, more adaptable to a blurring reality, though Ilara noted a new, unsettling quietness in playgrounds, a shift from boisterous shouts to hushed, imaginative games played beneath the fading stars. But it was in her aging parents that Ilara observed the cruelest, most intimate manifestation of these changes. Her childhood home, once a bastion of predictable rhythm and comforting familiarity, now felt like a stage set for a play no one remembered the lines to. Her mother, Eleanor, had always been the worrier, the one who meticulously planned every holiday, every family gathering. Now, she moved through the house with a serene, almost detached grace. Her worry had been transmuted, not into peace, but into that same unsettling cosmic connection Ilara saw in Mrs. Albright. She spoke less about mundane matters, and more about the interconnectedness of all things, the illusion of time, the beauty of dissolution. "Ilara," she'd whisper over lukewarm tea, her eyes fixed on something beyond the window pane. "Don't you feel it? The universe is speaking to us. It's showing us that everything is one, that our individual struggles, they're just fleeting sparks in an eternal blaze." Her words were soft, almost poetic, but they carried a terrifying undertone of resignation. There was no more fight, no more planning, just an embrace of the inevitable, a profound apathy that masked itself as spiritual awakening. The meticulous planning had ceased. The garden, once her mother's pride, now wilted, untended. Her father, Robert, a man of routine and pragmatism, had reacted differently. He clung to the familiar with a desperate, almost angry tenacity. He'd watch the evening news, though the reports grew increasingly vague and anodyne, focusing on local traffic and weather patterns that seemed utterly irrelevant against the backdrop of a merging cosmos. He'd insist on their weekly family dinner, even as the conversation became a series of polite non-sequiturs, punctuated by his sighs. His fear wasn't of the unknown, but of the loss of the known. The loss of his job at the city archives, deemed increasingly irrelevant as historical records felt less significant, had hit him hard, but his dread ran deeper than unemployment. It was the dread of the ground beneath his feet dissolving, of the concepts he'd built his life upon. Duty, hard work, legacy, becoming meaningless in the face of such vast, indifferent change. "It's just a phase, Ilara," he'd grumble one evening, picking at his food, the words hollow even to his own ears. "People will adjust. They always do." But his eyes, though they tried to project defiance, held a haunted, almost panicked glint. He'd retreat to his study, not to work, but to simply sit in the dim light, surrounded by books whose contents now seemed to whisper of a bygone era, of a linear time and stable universe that no longer existed. His connection to Eleanor was fraying, not through argument, but through an inability to meet her in her new, distant space. He saw her cosmic calm as a personal abandonment, a failure to fight for their shared reality. Ilara sat between them most evenings, a quiet observer. She felt the tug of each current within herself too, the allure of simply letting go, of surrendering to the cosmic embrace, and the chilling dread of all she held dear melting away. But a part of her, a resilient, almost stubborn core, refused to succumb. She still felt the need to understand, to witness, even if the understanding brought only a gentle, aching sorrow. The world was not crashing, it was simply transforming. And the human heart, so attuned to the rhythm of permanence, was struggling to find a new beat in this ethereal, sorrowful waltz. The quiet hum in her bones was growing louder, resonating with the silent, breaking hearts of those around her, a symphony of gentle, profound loss. Ilara's world was a hushed constellation of screens, each a window into an unfolding cosmic ballet. Her office, tucked away in the quiet hum of a research facility near the remnants of what used to be Pasadena, was a sanctuary of flickering light against the encroaching dusk outside. The air, thick with the scent of recycled oxygen and faint ozone, seemed to hold its breath. She leaned closer to the primary console, a translucent slab of polished obsidian that seemed to drink in the light, displaying a vast, intricate map of Andromeda. Her fingertips, almost reverently, skimmed across the surface, pulling, expanding, sifting through data streams that whispered of distant stars and the silent, grinding gears of gravity. Urus appeared then, a holographic shimmer in the corner of her vision, projected from his own distant bunker beneath the Sierra Nevadas. His face, etched with the familiar lines of perpetual contemplation, was a welcome, if spectral, presence. Still lost in the veil, Ilara? His voice, a low rumble, seemed to echo not just from his remote location, but from the depths of space itself. The veil thickens, Aris, she replied, her voice barely a murmur. The new data, it's a deluge. The Orion Deep Space Array is performing beyond specifications, and even the refurbished ground-based networks, the old Palomar-Rubin nexus, they're seeing things our ancestors could only dream of. Their collaboration was a delicate dance across continents and concepts. Their screens, though physically separated by hundreds of miles of weary land, mirrored each other, allowing them to point, annotate, and analyze in perfect synchronicity. The sheer volume of incoming information was staggering. Terabytes upon terabytes of spectrographic analyses, gravitational lensing anomalies, dark matter distribution maps, and high-resolution imagery, all streaming from a focus on the halo data from the Vanguard orbital telescopes, Aris instructed, his holographic finger highlighting a faint, almost imperceptible region on the edge of Andromeda's galactic disk. There's an energy signature anomaly there, too uniform to be natural stellar noise, almost engineered. Ilara zoomed in, her brow furrowing. The region, distant even within Andromeda, shimmered with a peculiar regularity that defied the chaotic beauty of typical star-forming regions. As she refined the filters, a pattern began to emerge, not of individual stars, but of their collective arrangement. It was like seeing a forest and suddenly discerning a hidden labyrinthine path within its chaos. "There's something here," she breathed, her voice dropping to an even lower whisper, as if afraid to disturb the cosmic secret. These aren't just star clusters, they're formations. The data, once a swirling nebula of abstract numbers, coalesced into startling visual clarity. What they were looking at were massive, ancient stellar structures deep within Andromeda's outer halo, formations of stars, dust, and dark matter that seemed to follow an impossibly precise geometric design. They were vast, sprawling across light years, yet their internal arrangement hinted at an underlying order. They weren't nebulae sculpted by the whims of stellar winds, nor clusters born of gravitational collapse. These were deliberate. "It's like looking at a blueprint," Aris said, his voice laced with an uncharacteristic awe. "But a blueprint for what? Or by whom?" Ilara, with a growing sense of unease that mingled with a profound scientific thrill, cross-referenced the coordinates. She ran pattern recognition algorithms, designed to detect improbable order within cosmic chaos. The algorithms, usually so stoic, screamed. It wasn't just geometric. There was an ajax. "Aris," she whispered, her fingers trembling slightly as she initiated a comparative analysis. "Run a parallel against the older high-resolution maps of our own Milky Way's halo. Specifically, the Lost Stars catalog, deep field scans beyond Magellanic Clouds." The processing core hummed, a gentle, almost meditative sound as it crunched through millennia of data, comparing the impossibly ancient patterns in Andromeda with the equally ancient, often overlooked, anomalies in their own galaxy. The suspense was a palpable thing, a heavy cloak draped over the quiet lab. Then the overlay appeared. A gasping, almost silent gasp escaped Ilara's lips. Aris's holographic form seemed to stiffen. There, on the left, was Andromeda's ancient, mythical stellar arrangement, a series of nested, hexagonal structures, each point a colossal star cluster, connected by faint, almost invisible tendrils of ionized gas and dark matter. And on the right, superimposed for direct comparison, was a section of the Milky Way's furthest halo, a region long dismissed as random debris from past dwarf galaxy interactions. But it wasn't random. Not at all. The Milky Way held, buried in its forgotten cosmic dust, a mirroring pattern. Not identical, but structurally analogous. A hexagonal framework, slightly distorted by their own galaxy's internal dynamics over eons, but undeniably similar. The same colossal scale, the same impossibly precise arrangement of star clusters, the same almost invisible filaments connecting them. It was like looking at two versions of the same ancient sigil, one pristine, the other weathered by unimaginable time and cosmic forces. "It can't be," Ilara murmured, the words barely audible. Her mind reeled, trying to reconcile the impossible. These formations, they're too similar, too deliberate. And they exist in regions of both galaxies that are considered primordial, untouched by the more recent, chaotic stellar evolution. Aris, usually so stoic, shook his head slowly. "This isn't gravitational resonance, Ilara. This isn't a statistical anomaly. This is a common signature, a shared architectonic." The implication hung heavy in the silent room, a cold, vast truth that made the hairs on Ilara's arms stand on end. For centuries, humanity had understood galaxies as isolated, magnificent islands in the cosmic ocean, their histories unique, their evolutions distinct. The collision was already challenging that, dissolving the physical boundaries. But this suggested a deeper, far more ancient connection, a cosmic umbilical cord that stretched back to the very dawn of creation, long before either galaxy truly became itself. What if, What if they weren't always separate? Ilara whispered, her voice laced with a strange, sorrowful wonder. Not just physically merging now, but always connected in some fundamental way we never conceived. As if they were two limbs of a much older, vaster entity that fragmented and are now slowly, inevitably, finding their way back to each other. The gentle, sorrowful merging described in the opening hook wasn't just a future event. It was a cosmic memory, an echo from a past so profound it bent the very fabric of understanding. The formations in Andromeda, ancient and alien, were also profoundly familiar, a ghost from their own galactic ancestry. It wasn't just a challenge to their current understanding, it was an obliteration of it. Our maps were incomplete, Eris said, his voice hushed, as if speaking in a cathedral of stars. Our histories fragmented. We thought we were charting individual destinies, but perhaps we've merely been witnessing the slow, agonizing separation, and now the equally slow, inevitable return. The screens hummed, displaying the ghostly, mirrored patterns. The quiet, philosophical dread that had settled over the world since the first whispers of the collision now deepened into something far more vast and unsettling. It wasn't just their sky that was dissolving, it was their very sense of belonging, their cherished narrative of cosmic solitude. They lived in the cosmic pause, yes, but now they understood it was also a pause between breaths of a single, ancient, impossibly grand being. And humanity, with all its struggles and aspirations, was merely a fleeting flicker within its immense, sorrowful heart. The shift was not a scream, but a sigh. A long, drawn-out exhalation across the vast, bruised canvas of night, settling onto the familiar contours of our world like a fine, invisible dust. And with it, almost imperceptibly at first, came the whispers from the earth itself. They weren't the monstrous roars of mutation we had braced for, the grotesque imaginings of a world undone by cosmic violence. No, these were softer, more profound, a testament to life's stubborn, sorrowful resilience. It began in the quiet places, far from the artificial glow of city lights, where the subtle energies of the collision found less interference. Along the winding trails of old-growth forests in the Pacific Northwest, where the air hung heavy with the scent of pine and damp earth, a new kind of light began to bloom. Not the harsh flash of bioluminescence some fungi had always possessed, but a diffuse, gentle shimmer that seemed to exhale from the very leaves of certain underbrush. Elderberry bushes, their usual dark green, now carried a faint ethereal aura, as if each leaf was a tiny, self-contained nebula. The ferns, unfurling their delicate fronds, sometimes caught and held this luminescence in a way that made them appear less like plants and more like living constellations fallen to earth. Researchers, those dedicated few who still walked the earth with a scientific eye, spoke of altered chlorophyll structures, of new, cosmic particle-driven metabolic pathways. But the farmers who first saw it, tending their fields in the pre-dawn hush of the Midwest, spoke of angels. They would find patches of their alfalfa fields, or the wild clover at the edge of their pastures, glowing with an otherworldly pale blue or a soft, pulsing violet. It was not enough light to read by, merely an intimation, a visual echo of something vast and beautiful and terrifying happening far above. It made the dew-kissed mornings feel like sacred spaces, temporary altars to a reality that was gently, irrevocably, slipping away from human comprehension. The sight brought a lump to the throat, a quiet grief for the simplicity of the past, now forever tinged with cosmic dust. The subtle changes extended to the fauna too. not in the way of fangs and extra limbs, but in the realm of behavior, of an almost spiritual attunement. The monarch butterflies, those fragile, tenacious travelers of North America, were among the first to show it. Their migrations, always a marvel, became even more enigmatic. Swarms would sometimes deviate from their established paths, not to avoid obstacles, but seemingly drawn by unseen currents, congregating in patterns on trees that had no logical explanation, resting in formations that mimicked complex, swirling nebulae. Their wings, when held to the light, sometimes showed an almost imperceptible iridescence, not previously documented, a fleeting spectrum of colors that shifted with the angle of the sun, as if reflecting a distant, alien star. It was a beauty born of displacement, a silent ode to journeys no longer solely guided by earthly winds. And the birds. Oh, the birds! Especially the nocturnal ones. Owls. Their calls, already steeped in mystery, developed an eerie, almost melodic cadence to their hoots, as if communicating across greater distances, or perhaps with entities we couldn't perceive. Their eyes, always piercing, seemed to hold a deeper, more ancient wisdom, reflecting the faint luminescence of the altered flora as they hunted in the twilight hours. But it was the songbirds that truly broke the heart. In isolated pockets, often near the glowing flora, their dawn choruses began to weave in new notes, frequencies that felt alien yet profoundly melancholic. Scientists recorded them, these new harmonics, noting their similarity to patterns found in deep space radio astronomy, to the subtle cosmic background radiation that now permeated everything. It was as if the birds were echoing the universe's own mournful song, a lament for what was, and a fragile, uncertain acceptance of what was to come. These pockets of transformation weren't uniform. They were sporadic, almost whimsical, appearing in unexpected places. A specific wetland in Florida where the alligator reeds glowed faintly green at night, drawing confusion. The sheer normalcy of the animals, their familiar forms still intact, made the behavioral shifts all the more unsettling. A deer, grazing quietly in a meadow near Boulder, Colorado, might suddenly freeze, its head tilted, listening not to the rustle of leaves or the snap of a twig, but to something beyond our auditory range, its dark eyes reflecting an unseen current. Bees, their hum already a constant undertone to summer, sometimes altered the geometry of their hives, building hexagonal cells with subtle, irregular deviations that, when analyzed by algorithms, hinted at fractal patterns found in the cosmic dust clouds now filtering through our atmosphere. There was no panic, not in the way one might expect with mutations. Instead, there was a quiet, pervasive sense of wonder mixed with an inescapable sorrow. People would stand in their yards, watching their neighborhood cats stalk shadows that now seemed to possess a faint internal glow. They'd observe crows meticulously, arranging pebbles into strange, symmetrical designs on their driveways, or watch fireflies flash in synchronized, unprecedented patterns, their bioluminescence now seemingly amplified. These weren't monsters emerging from the woods, they were familiar creatures, imbued with a new gentle strangeness, a living testament to the ongoing silent symphony of cosmic recalibration. These phenomena, localized and often fleeting, became points of hushed conversation, traded like secrets in grocery aisles and dimly lit cafes. No one screamed about invaders or plagues. Instead, there was a shared, unspoken understanding that life itself was stretching, adapting, finding new avenues to be in a universe that had unexpectedly, irrevocably changed its mind about permanence. The vibrant green of a leaf, the frantic buzz of a bee, the soaring arc of a bird. These were no longer just biological expressions. They were becoming living canvases for the cosmic embrace, tiny, breathing testaments to a merging that touched everything, from the farthest star to the deepest root. It was a gentle, sorrowful beauty, a whispered reminder that even in loss, life found a way to glow, to hum, to pattern itself anew, echoing the vast, silent truth of galaxies entwined. And in that quiet, melancholic adaptation, humanity found itself reflecting, not on its dominion over nature, but on its own fragile, beautiful place in a universe that was slowly, beautifully, becoming something entirely new. The air itself seemed to hum with a new, subtle frequency now. Not a sound one heard with ears, but one felt in the marrow, a tremor of the impending, everlasting chain. Nights had become a strange, unsettling canvas, no longer uniformly dark, but streaked with alien nebulosity, faint tendrils of Andromeda already reaching, like phantom limbs, into the familiar stardust of the Milky Way. It was a beauty that carried a profound sorrow, a visual elegy for the sky we had always known. We lived in a world where the cosmic was no longer a distant abstraction, but an encroaching, intimate reality. The great unraveling, or perhaps the great reweaving, was underway, quiet as a sigh. In the wake of this slow cosmological embrace, the old frameworks of understanding had fractured. Science, for all its predictive power, could describe what was happening, but offered little solace for why, or what it meant. Religions, too, grappled with prophecies that felt too small, too human-centric for a phenomenon of this magnitude. People sought anchors, something to hold on to in the vast, dissolving ocean of certainty. The familiar narratives of progress, of individual agency, of a stable future, felt suddenly fragile, like old paper disintegrating under a rain of starlight. There was a pervasive, gentle ache, a quiet disquiet that settled into the bones of every city, every home. It was into this yearning void that the forgotten works of Dr. Evelyn Reed began to resurface. Her name, once whispered in the quieter corners of fringe academia a century prior, now echoed with a newfound, almost desperate relevance. Reed, a cosmologist and philosopher ahead of her time, had proposed theories that had been dismissed as eccentric, poetic musings lacking empirical evidence. Now, faced with a universe actively defying our expectations, her words felt less like speculation and more like prescient whispers from the edge of understanding. She had spoken of the cosmos not with the detached language of physics, but with the heartfelt resonance of a mystic. Her magnum opus, The Cosmic Weave, a theory of universal recurrence and sentience, had been republished by a small independent press, initially selling only to a handful of academics and fringe thinkers. But the ideas contained within it were too compelling, too eerily resonant with the current cosmic ballet to remain confined. Reed posited a universe not as a collection of inert particles, but as an interconnected, conscious entity perpetually cycling through states of creation, collision, and re-emergence. She spoke of galaxies not as isolated islands, but as nodes in a grand, living network, their gravitational dance a form of communication, their eventual mergings not a cataclysmic end. For Reed, consciousness wasn't an emergent property of complex biological systems alone, but an intrinsic quality of existence itself, rippling through the very fabric of space-time. Stars were not just nuclear furnaces, but incandescent cells, nebulae, the ethereal breath of the cosmos. A galactic collision, then, was not a violent accident, but a slow, deliberate act of self-assimilation, a grand universal exhale before a new, unimaginable inhalation. The Andromeda-Milky Way merging, she wrote, was merely one instance of this eternal, conscious ebb and flow. It was an act of the universe remembering itself, dissolving old boundaries to weave new identities. This philosophical framework, at once vast and intimately personal, offered a different way to grieve and perhaps to hope. Elara found Reed's texts not in a library, which seemed almost antiquated in this era of digital dissemination, but through a faded, water-stained digital scan shared surreptitiously in an online forum dedicated to new cosmologies for a new sky. Her initial skepticism, honed by years of rational scientific thought, was quickly eroded by a profound sense of recognition. Reed's language, though academic, carried the weight of poetry, its sentences constructed with a gentle, melancholic rhythm that mirrored the pervasive mood of the world. It felt like reading a letter from a distant, wise ancestor. She printed the entire volume, the pages crisp beneath her fingertips, feeling a curious, almost archaeological thrill. Her apartment, usually bathed in the cool, sterile glow of data screens, now found itself illuminated by the softer light of a reading lamp, casting long shadows against the stacks of printed pages. She underlined passages, scribbled frantic notes in the margins, her mind a flurry of questions and dawning revelations. The scent of old paper and ink filled her small space, a grounding aroma against the cosmic vertigo. The greatest fear, Reed had written, is not that we are alone, but that we are merely a fragment, perpetually yearning for the whole. Elara traced the words with her finger. This wasn't about the destruction of a galaxy or even the end of humanity. It was about the dismantling of the idea of separateness. The universe wasn't ending, it was changing its minding. It was choosing to reintegrate, to become something more vast, more encompassing than its disparate parts. This lens, though difficult to fully grasp, offered a strange, almost comforting framework. It shifted the narrative from a tragedy of loss to a grand, if sorrowful, evolution. If the universe itself was conscious, then perhaps this merging was an act of profound, universal meditation, a slow intake of breath before an unimaginable transformation. Elara found herself spending hours poring over the chapters, detailing the fractal nature of cosmic identity and gravitational consciousness and interspecies empathy, her mind reaching for a truth that felt both ancient and radically new. The sadness didn't dissipate, but it transformed, becoming less a gnawing dread and more a quiet reverence for the cosmic process. She was not alone in her search. The online forum, once a niche corner for speculative thought, began to pulse with renewed activity. References to Reed's work became increasingly common, her name whispered like a secret password among those seeking meaning beyond the purely observable. It was there, in a thread titled Echoes of the Great Recurrence, that Elara first encountered Aris. Aris had posted a meticulously compiled bibliography of Reed's lesser-known essays and correspondences, cross-referencing them with ancient spiritual texts from disparate cultures. His posts were articulate, deeply thoughtful, and tinged with a philosophical melancholy that resonated with Elara's own quiet despair. He seemed to approach Reed's theories not just with intellectual curiosity, but with a profound, almost spiritual hunger for understanding. His voice, even in text, carried the gentle weight of someone who had long wrestled with immense questions in solitude. Reed's genius, Aris had written in one comment, lies not in offering definitive answers, but in crafting a language vast enough to articulate the questions we now face. She dared to imagine a universe with intention. Ilara felt a strange pull. His words were precise, echoing sentiments she had struggled to articulate herself. He saw the same nuances, felt the same profound sorrow laced with wonder. She had always been a solitary figure, even before the skies began to shift, preferring the quiet company of data to the unpredictable currents of human interaction. But now, as the boundaries of her world dissolved, the idea of a kindred mind, a shared intellectual and emotional journey, felt suddenly vital. The vastness of the cosmos had shrunk the distance between isolated souls, compelling them to seek connection. She hesitated for days, drafting and deleting messages, the glow of her screen reflecting the faint ethereal streaks of Andromeda outside her window. The act of reaching out felt monumental, a tiny human gesture against the backdrop of an infinitely expanding, merging universe. Yet, the yearning for connection, for someone who saw the world through a similar, sorrow-tinged lens, ultimately overcame her reticence. Finally, she sent a brief, carefully worded message. "Your insights on Reed's work are profound. I've been immersed in the cosmic weave for weeks, and your interpretation of the cosmic conversation truly resonated. Have you delved into her?" A reply came within hours, not with the clipped brevity she expected from online interactions, but with a surprising warmth and depth. Aris detailed his own deep dive into those very essays, citing specific passages and drawing parallels Ilara hadn't yet considered. Their exchange began, tentative at first, then growing into a steady, quiet correspondence, a shared exploration of a philosopher's long-forgotten wisdom, now vital for navigating a universe in the throes of its own beautiful, heartbreaking transformation. In the midst of the vast cosmic merging, a smaller, quieter convergence of minds was beginning, finding solace and understanding in the whispers of a forgotten prophet. The universe was reshaping itself, and in its shadow, so too were the delicate architectures of human connection and meaning, slowly, tenderly, forming anew. It was no longer a matter of looking up for Andromeda. Andromeda had simply become the sky. Not a distant smudge, not a celestial ghost haunting the periphery of our familiar stellar neighborhood, but an undeniable, luminous presence woven into the very fabric of night. The veil had been lifted, or perhaps re-embroidered. Now, when the sun dipped below the bruised horizon, painting the clouds in shades of muted apricot and despairing violet, the emergent canvas above was not the deep, reassuring indigo we had known. It was a sprawling, intricate tapestry, shimmering with the impossible light of two colossal entities locked in an eons-long ballet. Our own Milky Way, with its familiar milky river of stars and dark, winding dust lanes, remained a constant. But it was no longer singular, no longer the sole monarch of our perception. Intertwining, overlaying, and dissolving into its familiar contours were the spiraling arms of the Andromeda Galaxy. They were ethereal, these invading arms, spun from countless suns too distant to resolve individually, coalescing instead into hazy, luminous swaths of incandescent blue and silver, punctuated by vast, roiling. One arm in particular arced across the zenith, a shimmering bridge connecting what felt like two separate realities. It moved, or rather I seemed to move, with an imperceptible slowness, a cosmic current pulling at the very edges of perception, twisting and folding with a grace that was both terrifying and utterly captivating. The sheer scale was overwhelming. There was no longer a patch of true, unblemished darkness in the night sky. Every corner, from the whispered edges of the horizon to the deepest, most profound black, held the faint, diffused glow of colliding light. It was as if the universe had decided to open its deepest, most private chambers and invite us to witness its relentless creation and recreation. Some found it beautiful, a new, unparalleled aesthetic. The artists of this strange new world struggled to capture its elusive grandeur, their canvases filled with swirling nebulae and ghostly galactic tendrils. Poets, their voices hushed by the enormity, found new metaphors for love and loss in the slow dance of hydrogen clouds. But for many, the beauty was inextricably laced with a profound, aching melancholy. The sky, once a symbol of stoic constancy, an anchor in the turbulent seas of human existence, had betrayed its nature. It was dynamic, mutable, and terrifyingly alive. The constellations, those ancient guides and storytellers, were still there, but they were now ghostly imprints on a vastly more complex, vibrant backdrop. Orion's belt seemed less a hunter's boast and more a forgotten whisper, his familiar outline muted by the encroaching, alien luminescence. It was like watching a beloved ancient tapestry slowly being rewoven with entirely new threads, intricate and mesmerizing, but utterly altering the original design. The old comfort, the predictable solace of a familiar sky, was gone, replaced by a constant, gentle hum of cosmic impermanence. We had always gazed at the stars and felt small, but this was different. This was not the smallness of an individual against an unchanging, infinite void. This was the smallness of all humanity, of our entire planet, against a cosmic process so vast and so slow that it swallowed up millennia. And yet, we were here, living through a fleeting, precious moment of its most dramatic phase. Every night, the change was imperceptible, yet every year, the accumulated shift was undeniable. A tendril of Andromeda seemed to have stretched a little further, a new knot of stars had tightened, or a familiar cluster of our own galaxy was now partially obscured by the faint, shimmering dust of another. This pervasive visual merger became a constant, silent reminder of the impermanence of all things. Our structures, our institutions, our very understanding of identity, they all felt suddenly fragile, temporary. If the sky itself, the very canvas of eternity, could be so fundamentally altered, what hope did the transient aspirations of humanity hold? Conversations often drifted to it, not with panic, but with a quiet, philosophical resignation. Remember when the sky was just dark? Someone would murmur, gazing upwards from a dimly lit porch. Remember when we could pick out the Big Dipper without Andromeda's arm spilling across it? These weren't complaints, merely observations, etched with the sorrow of a forgotten past. Yet, in this shared melancholy, there emerged an unexpected thread of interconnectedness. Under this evolving celestial canvas, humanity stood, perhaps for the first time in its history, truly collective. The merger was not a localized phenomenon. It embraced every continent, every city, every lonely farmstead. Whether you were in a bustling metropolis like New York, where the new galactic arms fought a losing battle against the city's light pollution, appearing as subtle, glowing hazes, or in the serene darkness of the Arizona desert, where their full, terrifying splendor was unfurled, people gathered, not in panicked crowds, but in quiet, communal observation. Families sat on rooftops, blankets pulled tight against the chill. Strangers on park benches would share a silent upward gaze. There was a universality to the awe, a shared weight to the sadness that transcended borders and beliefs. The old arguments, the petty divisions, seemed to shrink beneath the indifferent grandeur of two galaxies embracing. What was a political squabble or an economic crisis in the face of such overwhelming celestial drama? Children, who had known no other sky, accepted it with a curious solemnity. They drew pictures of the two galaxies, their arms reaching, touching, blending. They pointed out new constellations formed by the intersecting light, weaving new myths for a new cosmos. For them, this was simply the way the universe was, a beautiful, sad, ever-changing masterpiece. But for those who remembered the old sky, there was a constant, gentle ache, a nostalgic longing for a darkness that would never return, for a sense of stability that had proven to be merely a momentary illusion. We lived in a world where the future of the night was visible, unfurling above us with an unimaginable slowness. It was a future of blending, of merging, of a quiet dissolution into something entirely new and alien. And every night, as the stars coalesced into shimmering, weaving tapestries, we were reminded that even the grandest, most ancient structures of the universe were not immune to change, to loss, and to the quiet, inevitable transformation that we whispered our thoughts into the encroaching light, hoping our tiny voices might somehow echo across the unfolding cosmic embrace. The shift had begun imperceptibly, a tremor not in the earth, but in the quiet, inner landscapes of human minds. At first, they were dismissed as coincidence, a new, peculiar strain of collective delusion, perhaps induced by the ceaseless hum of the world's anxieties. But the whispers grew louder, crossing time zones and social strata, manifesting in the dim glow of screens and the hushed tones of coffee shop confessions. People were dreaming the same dreams. It started with fragments, a wash of indigo and violet, the impossible geometry of an unfamiliar nebula, a whisper of a scent like ozone, and crushed starlight. Then came the landscapes, vast, crystalline plains under twin suns, forests of bioluminescent fungi that pulsed with an otherworldly rhythm, cities built into the hollows of gargantuan, ancient trees. These weren't the chaotic jumble of typical dream logic. They were cohesive, strangely consistent, and suffused with an emotional resonance that felt both alien and profoundly familiar. The news channels, usually so quick to sensationalize, found themselves grappling with a phenomenon too subtle for their usual theatric. Psychologists spoke of a burgeoning collective unconscious, but the term felt inadequate, a clinical label failing to capture the vivid, almost eye-tactile quality of these shared experiences. Online forums became a sprawling archive of identical visions, posts describing flora that coiled like living fractals, or creatures that moved with an oceanic grace, their forms rendered in hues unknown to Earth. There was a poignant, melancholic beauty to it all, a sense of having glimpsed a reality that was not, and yet was now, irrevocably intertwined with their own. But beyond the visual spectacle, there was something deeper, more unsettling, a pervasive sense of unity. Not the kind of unity preached in self-help seminars, but an unavoidable, almost inescapable melding of awareness. Individuals reported fleeting moments in their waking lives, a sudden, unbidden surge of emotion that wasn't theirs, a thought articulated in their inner voice that felt foreign yet perfectly understood. It was as if the cosmic embrace of Andromeda, the slow, silent ballet unfolding in the heavens, was having its own internal echo, a gentle, sorrowful merging of consciousness itself. Elara had watched it unfold with a detached fascination, the way one might observe a slow-motion disaster from a safe distance, a quiet dread stirring beneath her ribs. She worked from home, her small apartment overlooking a quiet street in what used to be a bustling city, now muted by the pervasive sense of unreality. The screens she monitored tracked shifts in atmospheric pressure and subtle gravitational anomalies, data points that spoke of the immense, silent forces at play millions of light-years away. But the true data was in the hushed conversations of her neighbors, the bewildered articles shared across her feeds, the deepening shadows beneath her own eyes. She'd always considered herself an anchor, a tethered point in a universe of chaos. Her mind was her fortress, meticulously organized, rigorously logical. She mediated on the concept of self, of identity, as a precious, distinct entity. The thought of it dissolving, not into the comforting embrace of a loved one, but into an unknown alien gestalt, filled her with a profound, almost philosophical sadness. It wasn't an invasion, it was a dilution. Then, the whispers began for her. It was subtle at first, a faint tremor at the periphery of her thoughts. One evening, as she brewed her chamomile tea, staring out at the muted twilight, a flash of something foreign brushed against her mind. Not a coherent image, but a feeling. A vast, ancient patience, combined with a yearning so profound it made her chest ache. It lasted only a second. A fleeting ghost, and then it was gone, leaving behind only the scent of herbs and the familiar hum of her refrigerator. She dismissed it as fatigue, a byproduct of too many late nights spent deciphering data streams that sang of galaxies colliding. But the incidents grew more frequent, more defined. She'd be reading a book, her focus absolute, when a sudden image would bloom behind her eyes. Not the words on the page, but a spiral arm of stars, incandescent in hues she couldn't name, slowly, inexorably twisting. Or a taste, metallic and sweet, would prickle her tongue, entirely unprovoked. These were not hallucinations, not in the panicked sense. They were more like echoes, faint reverberations from a distant, immense chamber. One morning, she woke with the distinct impression of having spent the night not in her bed, but floating in a sea of liquid light. The dream itself was gone, leaving only the residue of a profound, disorienting peace. She felt stretched, thinned, as if a part of her had drifted away, and a part of something else had settled in its place. "It's like a soft invasion," her friend Liam had mused during their weekly video call, his usually sharp eyes holding a bewildered softness. Not with guns, but with dreams, with feelings. "It's a little terrifying, Ilara, to not know what's yours anymore." Ilara had simply nodded, her gaze drifting to the window. It was terrifying, but also, strangely, compelling. The true breakthrough came during her nightly meditation. She sat cross-legged on her mat, the familiar practice of focusing on her breath, a bulwark against the mounting strangeness of the world. But tonight, the bulwark crumbled. As her mind quieted, dissolving the everyday anxieties, a vastness began to assert itself. It wasn't the emptiness she usually sought, but a fullness, a symphony of myriad thoughts and emotions, like an ocean of consciousness, gently lapping against the shores of her own. She saw, not with her eyes, but with a deeper, internal faculty. She saw the familiar curve of Earth, swathed in its delicate blue, but superimposed over it, like a transparent veil, was a landscape she recognized from the proliferating reports. Towering, crystalline spires that caught the light of a distant. She felt the warmth of that sun, tasted the faint mineral tang of the air, and heard a sound that was less a sound and more a vibration. a deep, resonant hum that thrummed through her very bones. It wasn't a vision of an alien landscape. It was a vision She wasn't an observer. She was, for a fleeting, terrifying moment, and she was not alone. She felt the presence of others, countless others, not distinct individuals, but shimmering nodes in a vast interconnected web. Their thoughts were not words, but pure intention, their emotions a collective tide of wonder, and a sorrow so immense it felt like the very fabric of existence was weeping. A wave of it washed over her, the pervasive sense of unity. It was not a forced merging, but a gentle, inevitable communion, born of proximity, of two cosmic entities, slowly, beautifully, heartbreakingly intertwined. Her own thoughts, her own unique Elariness, felt like a small, distinct ripple in this boundless ocean. She was still herself, yes, but also undeniably more. She was a part of something vaster, older, and infinitely stranger than she had ever conceived. The lines blurred. Her personal consciousness, her carefully constructed sense of self, began to fray at the edges, dissolving into the universal awareness. It was like holding a single drop of water and realizing it was intrinsically, irrevocably part of the rain, the river, the sea. The distinctness was an illusion, a temporary segregation. When she finally opened her eyes, the apartment was still, the familiar lamp casting its warm glow. But nothing was truly familiar anymore. Her hands felt strangely foreign, connected not just to her own body, but to an invisible network of being. The silence of her room was filled with the soft hum of the universe, a silent chorus of shared dreams and collective anxieties, of alien landscapes glimpsed in the deep folds of sleep. She stood, walked to the window, and looked up. The sky was a familiar deep blue, stars beginning to prick through. But she knew now that those weren't just the stars of her Milky Way. They were the nascent, luminous whispers of Andromeda, already inside her, already part of everything. The solitude she had once cherished felt like a forgotten language. She was no longer just Elara. She was a tiny, fragile node in a cosmic brain, forever connected, forever changed. And in that profound, terrifying realization, a tear traced a path down her cheek, a silent testament to a self both lost and found. The sky. Oh, the sky. It wasn't merely the night canvas from childhood stories anymore. It was a vast, shimmering wound, or perhaps a glorious cosmic birthmark. The scars and beauties of two behemoths entwined. Andromeda, once a distant smudge of light, now dominated the zenith, a colossal swirl of alien stars and nebulae, bleeding into the familiar arms of our own Milky Way. Its presence wasn't just visual, it was a palpable pressure, a silent hum that seemed to resonate deep within the very bones of the planet. We had been living in the cosmic pause, the breathless inhale, but now the galaxies were fully, utterly intertwined. Their dance had reached its slow, mesmerizing crescendo, and with it a new silence began to unfurl across our world. The noise of human civilization, once a ceaseless, pervasive roar, seemed to quiet, not with a sudden crack, but with a gentle, sorrowful sigh. The urgent, demanding thrum of daily life that had defined our existence for millennia began to recede. Like a tide pulling back from a shore it had once furiously battered. Freeways, once arteries choked with the pulsating lifeblood of commerce and ambition, now carried only a sparse, almost respectful trickle of vehicles. Their hum, once a symbol of progress, felt ancient, out of place, a relic of a frantic striving that no longer held meaning. The air, particularly in the sprawling cities of the United States, tasted different, cleaner, perhaps, but also imbued with a strange contemplative weight. People were less driven by the feverish pursuit of material gain. The endless cycle of desire and acquisition had, for many, simply stopped. What was the point of a newer car, a grander house, a more fashionable garment, when the very fabric of the cosmos was reweaving itself before our eyes? The glossy advertisements that still flickered on public screens, those vibrant siren calls of consumption, now seemed absurd, almost painfully quaint, against the backdrop of an Andromeda arm stretching across half the sky, its alien stars glittering with. Malls, once bustling cathedrals of commerce, became hushed, cavernous spaces. Shoppers drifted through them like specters, not seeking, but observing, their gazes often drawn upwards through skylights, past the manufactured glitter, towards the genuine, terrifying majesty outside. A gentle societal deceleration took hold, a pervasive, thoughtful silence that permeated every corner of our lives. Meetings in corporate towers, once charged with aggressive strategy and financial forecasts, now often devolved into long silences, punctuated by a collective sigh or a quiet, whispered observation about the night sky. The frantic pace of technological innovation, once a source of pride and purpose, slackened. Why build faster when the universe had so profoundly slowed us down? The grand narratives of human progress, of conquering nature, of infinite growth, began to feel like fragile, forgotten myths, whispered by children in the face of an unfathomable cosmic parent. Even the hum of personal devices, the constant ping of notifications, seemed less insistent, often ignored. We found ourselves reaching for them less, our fingers hesitant, as if the connection they offered to the fleeting concerns of our species felt increasingly trivial. Conversations, too, changed. The rapid-fire exchange of pleasantries, the boasts of achievement, the complaints about daily annoyances, these faded, replaced by longer pauses, by questions that stretched beyond the mundane, touching on existence, on time, on the sheer, bewildering scale of it all. We spoke of dreams, not of careers, of fears, not of mortgages, of beauty, not of brands. Families gathered more frequently, not for boisterous celebrations, but for quiet evenings spent on porches or rooftops, simply watching. The children, born into this new sky, pointed with awe and a quiet understanding, their innocent eyes seeing the new reality with a clarity that sometimes shamed our adult resistance. The elderly, who remembered a sky that was purely ours, offered wisdom couched in melancholy, their voices thin whispers against the vastness. They spoke of the quiet terror of seeing the familiar dissolve, and the strange, unexpected peace that came with surrender. This wasn't a world of chaos or collapse, not in the traditional, violent sense. It was a world of profound adjustment, a quiet, almost imperceptible shift in the collective human psyche. We were learning to inhabit a smaller, more humble space within the cosmic drama. The urgency had bled out of the days, leaving behind a curious blend of sorrow and wonder. What was purpose when the universe declared its own, on a scale that dwarfed all our ambitions? What was permanence when galaxies could merge and reshape the very concept of home? The silence wasn't empty. It was full of questions, heavy with contemplation. We adjusted to our new place, not as masters of our destiny, but as tiny, ephemeral witnesses to a truth so grand it rearranged the very atoms of our understanding. We were no longer simply living on Earth, but in the heart of something infinitely larger, stranger, and more beautiful than we had ever conceived. We had once striven for connection, for meaning, for a legacy to outlast us. Now we were connected to an alien galaxy, our meaning redefined by its quiet, undeniable presence, our legacy simply to have borne witness to the slow, heartbreaking transformation of everything we thought we knew. The quiet hum of existence was all that remained, a shared, melancholic breath in the vast, unfolding universe. The sky was no longer a fixed tapestry, but a living, breathing current of light. Each dusk brought a subtle, almost imperceptible shift, a slow drift of familiar beacons giving way to strangers. Elara watched it from her window, a ritual she'd adopted since the whispers had grown louder, the faint hum beneath her feet, a steady thrum in her bones. The Milky Way, once a comforting river of silver, was now a braid interwoven with the alien gold of Andromeda. Its stars, once distinct, now bled into hers, creating a celestial chaos that was both terrifying and profoundly beautiful. It wasn't a crash, not in the violent cinematic way the old films had predicted. It was an embrace, a millennia-long waltz that was only now beginning to reveal its full choreography to the naked eye. What had begun as statistical anomalies, then blurred photographs, was now the nightly spectacle. New points of light, pinpricks from another galaxy, slowly, majestically entered our field of vision, appearing like hesitant guests at a grand, silent ball. And just as slowly, some familiar friends from Earth's own ancient sky would seem to dim, recede, swallowed by the encroaching brilliance, or perhaps merely shifting their cosmic position in the evolving dance. This wasn't just a scientific marvel. It was an emotional earthquake. Old navigation charts were obsolete. Astrology became a quaint, mournful folk tale, and the very concept of home in the cosmos felt like a discarded husk. In this quiet, inescapable truth, humanity had found itself adrift, not on the vast seas of Earth, but in the boundless, altering ocean of space itself. Yet, humanity, ever resilient in its fragility, found ways to cope. As the stars continued their slow intermingling, patterns would emerge, not the grand, eternal figures of the past, but fleeting, temporary arrangements like reflections on water. Communities, driven by a primal need for meaning, began to name them. Not with the authority of astronomers, but with the quiet consensus of neighbors gathering in their backyards or in designated dark sky parks, speaking in hushed tones, as if not to startle the delicate constellations. These ephemeral patterns became symbols. The weaver's knot someone called a swirling cluster that lasted a scant month before dissolving into new configurations. Another, a triangle of particularly bright, short-lived stars, was named the departing gaze. Elara remembered one, a wispy trail that lingered for just a few weeks in the autumn sky, named the Lost Child, a name whispered by a collective of grieving parents in a distant state, its sorrow echoing across the news feeds. Each name was a tiny monument to change, to loss, to the aching beauty of moments that, by their very nature, could not last. They were the universe's whispered poems of impermanence, each stanza etched in starlight, only to be erased and rewritten the next night. For Elara, the shifts had only deepened her solitude. She worked from home, like many, her job a series of remote, digitized tasks that felt increasingly meaningless under the vast, transforming sky. The world outside often felt muted, the collective grief for a lost sky manifesting as a quiet retreat, a turning inward. So when an old flyer, tacked to a corkboard in her local grocery store, announced a celestial soiree at the Old Town Observatory, now less a place of scientific research and more a community gathering spot, she hesitated. It was for a specific purpose, to observe, discuss, and perhaps, collaboratively, name a newly forming cluster of stars that had been visible for the past 2 nights. She arrived as the last of the twilight bled from the western horizon, painting the sky in a palette of deep purples and bruised oranges, the nascent stars already pricking through. The observatory itself was a crumbling brick structure, its dome now more of a curiosity than a functioning instrument, its mirrors long since incapable of resolving the truly distant, deeply merged cosmic objects. Tonight, a few small portable telescopes were set up on tripods on the surrounding lawn. Their lenses pointed not at distant nebulae, but at the immediate, shifting spectacle overhead. A handful of people had gathered, maybe 20 or so, a quiet congregation. There were a few families, children bundled in blankets, pointing with wide-eyed wonder. There were older couples, their faces etched with a different kind of wonder, a mournful reverence for a sky they no longer recognized. And there were a few solitary figures like Ilara, drawn by a shared unspoken need. No one spoke loudly. Conversations were hushed, almost reverent, as if the very act of speaking above a whisper might shatter the fragile beauty unfolding above. A woman with kind eyes and a low, soothing voice was projecting star charts onto a portable screen, pointing out the projected paths of the merging galaxies, showing where new light sources were predicted to appear and where old ones might recede. "This cluster," she said softly, gesturing towards the screen, then up at the darkening sky. "It's been growing for the last 3 days. It wasn't there last week. It's truly a child of Andromeda, a few stars from its outer arm, now caught in our gravitational dance." Ilara lifted her gaze. There it was, a faint, loose gathering of perhaps a dozen stars, too indistinct to be a traditional constellation, yet undeniably a new pattern. It pulsed with a subtle pale blue light, distinct from the sharper, whiter diamonds of the familiar Milky Way. It was beautiful in its novelty, heartbreaking in its transience. Someone suggested the drifter. Another, Andromeda's sigh. A young girl, maybe 7 years old, wrapped in a blanket adorned with glow-in-the-dark stars, piped up in a small voice, the blue whisper. A collective murmur rippled through the group. It fit. The stars themselves seemed to whisper, to hint at stories not quite our own. The woman who had spoken earlier smiled. "The blue whisper it is, then, for as long as it graces our sky." She then invited everyone to look through the telescopes, to see if they could discern more, to truly feeling the presence of this new temporary visitor. Ilara waited her turn. When she finally peered into the eyepiece, the blue cluster resolved into a slightly sharper, more vibrant grouping. It wasn't a dazzling spectacle, but an intimate one. She saw the individual pinpricks, each a sun, perhaps with its own worlds, its own stories, now part of your sky, even if only for a short cosmic breath. It was a fragment of another galaxy, caught in the slow, beautiful, heartbreaking merging. Looking up from the telescope, Ilara found herself standing beside an older man, his face weathered, his eyes thoughtful. He didn't say anything, just offered a small, knowing nod. In that silent exchange, Ilara felt a peculiar, fragile connection. It wasn't the boisterous camaraderie of a celebration, but a shared understanding of profound, universal change. It was a communal melancholy, a collective awe at the impermanence of all things, even stars. The air was cool, carrying the scent of damp earth and distant wood smoke. Above them, the blue whisper hung, a temporary testament to the ongoing cosmic embrace. It would fade, dissolve, rearrange itself into something new, something else. But for this night, under this shifting sky, Alara wasn't entirely alone in her contemplation of the universe's quiet, sorrowful dissolution and rebirth. This fragile sense of community, born of shared celestial wonder and quiet grief, was a beacon in itself, a temporary constellation of human hearts against the vast, transforming dark. It was a gentle whisper in the face of an epic, beautiful loss, and for a moment, it felt like enough. The peak arrived not with a roar nor a rending, but with a breath held so long the universe itself seemed to sigh. We had been told, whispered to, about the impending collision, a gentle caress across cosmic eons, not a cataclysmic crash. Yet, the word collision carried with it an inherent violence that our eyes, our hearts, were unprepared to fully shed. Tonight, though, standing beneath a sky that had ceased to be merely Gowers, the final vestiges of that fear dissolved, not into relief, but into something far more profound, a quiet, overwhelming surrender. The night sky was no longer a familiar map, a comforting canvas upon which generations had charted their course and dreams. It was a boundless, swirling kaleidoscope, a liquid tapestry woven from threads of starlight, now so densely packed they seemed to spill over each other, like sand from an hourglass that had shattered in mid-pour. Where once the Milky Way traced its luminous, cloudy band, now it intertwined with the grand elliptical arms of Andromeda, each star a pinprick of defiant light, each nebula a smudged whisper of creation. There was no sound, of course. No thunder, no cosmic shriek. Only the soft, insistent hum of our own breath, the thrum of blood in our ears, as we craned our necks, our gazes lost in a sea of incandescent dust and ancient hydrogen. It was a silence so absolute, so vast, that it seemed to absorb all earthly noise, all human anxiety, leaving only the bare, vulnerable self exposed to the unfathomable. This was the moment predicted, yet indescribable, the moment when two titans, once distinct and distant, held each other in an embrace so slow, so deliberate, it transcended the very notion of time. It was breathtaking, certainly, a beauty so immense it brought a strange, heavy ache to the chest. To look up was to see not just stars, but galaxies of stars, entire clusters that had once belonged to Andromeda, now dancing in our celestial backyard. The great rift, that dark, familiar wound in our own galaxy, was now crisscrossed by alien dark lanes, vast stretches of cosmic dust from Andromeda, creating new, shifting patterns. Blues and yellows and fiery oranges mingled with the cool whites and deep reds we knew, painting a tableau that defied artistic replication. Each star was a tiny, perfect diamond, but together they were a river of molten silver and gold, flowing across the zenith. But this beauty carried with it a profound melancholy, a quiet sorrow for what was lost. We had taken the old sky for granted, the constancy of its constellations, the reassuring predictability of its cosmic landmarks. Polaris, the steadfast guide, the Big Dipper, the comforting ladle, Orion, the eternal hunter. They were still there, perhaps, but now drowned, overshadowed, their familiar forms almost obliterated by the sheer, magnificent invasion of light. It was like watching an old friend transform into someone new, beautiful, yes, but undeniably altered. The comfortable familiarity replaced by a stunning, yet alien, grandeur. A child, clutching her mother's hand in a park in what was once rural Kansas, pointed a trembling finger upwards. "Mommy," she whispered, her voice barely audible above the silent awe of the crowd, "where did our stars go?" The mother, her own eyes wide with unshed tears, could only pull the child closer, burying her face in soft hair. There was no simple answer. Our stars were still there, yes, but they were no longer just ours. They were part of a vast, shared inheritance, an undeniable declaration that individuality, even at the galactic scale, was merely a temporary illusion. The surrender was not one of defeat, but of acceptance. What choice did we have? Tiny beings tethered to a pale blue dot, but to witness and to feel. This wasn't a problem to be solved, a challenge to be overcome. It was simply is. It was the universe unfolding its true, majestic, terrifying nature, reminding us of our infinitesimal place within its grand design. And in that surrender, there was a strange, humbling peace. The frantic pace of human life, the incessant worries of economy and politics, the petty squabbles, they all seemed to shrink to microscopic proportions beneath this monumental display. We were all equally children under a new shared sky. This redefinition of home was the most piercing truth of all. For generations, home had been Earth, our solar system, our Milky Way. These were fixed points, anchors in the vastness. But now, our cosmic address had changed, irrevocably. We were not just residents of the Milky Way. We were inhabitants of Milkomeda or Milkdromeda, as some whispered the nascent name. We were dwellers in an intergalactic embrace, our very existence now, a testament to cosmic confluence. How does one feel at home when the very fabric of one's celestial belonging has been rewoven? Is home a physical location, a patch of ground beneath one's feet? Or is it a state of mind, a feeling of security and belonging, no matter how alien the surroundings? The quiet philosopher in the small-town diner, sipping lukewarm coffee, might muse that home was never truly about the stars above, but about the connections between us, the warm glow of human companionship against the cold indifference of the cosmos. Yet, even that felt inadequate tonight. The cosmos was no longer indifferent. It was actively, beautifully, sorrowfully transforming everything we thought we knew. The cities, their lights usually a defiant glow against the velvet black, now seemed subdued, their artificial brilliance diminished by the incandescent ocean above. People still walked the streets, still went about their lives, but with a new reverence, a subtle shift in their gait, a heightened awareness of the enormity that pressed down from above. The old narratives of human exceptionalism felt fragile, almost quaint. We were not masters of our destiny, but passengers on a slow, deliberate journey of cosmic recreation. As the pre-dawn light began to seep into the edges of the merged galaxies, painting the eastern horizon with hues of bruised purple and faint rose, the stars did not vanish as quickly as they once had. They clung, stubborn and brilliant, fighting the encroaching sun with their collective might, unwilling to cede their magnificent display. For a precious few moments, the sun rose into a sky still thick with the interwoven tapestries of two galaxies, a vision of staggering, impossible beauty. It was a promise, perhaps, that even in the brightest day, the quiet, melancholic truth of our transformed home would linger, a perpetual echo in the vast, silent chambers of our new, shared universe. And as the last stubborn star from Andromeda finally faded, leaving behind only the familiar blue, one couldn't help but feel a profound, aching sense of longing for the bewildering, beautiful chaos of the night. We were home, yes, but it was a home utterly, wonderfully, sorrowfully remade. The air still tasted of ozone and ancient starlight, even years after the final, visible tendrils of Andromeda had woven themselves irrevocably into the fabric of our own Milky Way. The sky, once a familiar canvas of scattered diamonds, was now a tapestry of impossible depth, a swirling vortex of incandescent nebulae and dark, echoing dust lanes. It was no longer a matter of looking groupé at a galaxy. It was like being submerged within one, or rather HE2, that had become one. Life continued, of course. It always does, a stubborn green shoot pushing through cosmic ash. The initial panic, the scientific fervor, the desperate prayers, and the equally desperate denials, they had all receded into the collective memory, becoming cautionary tales for children who had never known a single, solitary sky. Now the blended galaxy was simply the sky. The old constellations, once markers of human myth and navigation, were fractured, rearranged, or simply swallowed by the blinding alien core of the newcomer. Polaris was gone, lost in the new super-bright heart, making way for a new, shifting celestial north that defied human naming. The cities still hummed, though with a different resonance. Streetlights were fewer, dimmed by necessity and by a profound, pervasive sense of humility. What use were 1,000 artificial suns when the cosmos above flared with such an untamed, silent glory? People walked with a new gait, heads tilted perpetually upwards, as if seeking answers not in their screens, but in the ceaseless, slow-motion ballet overhead. The old narratives of progress and conquest had faded, replaced by a quiet, often melancholic, understanding of our own infinitesimal place in this grand, unfolding drama. We were not masters of our destiny, but passengers on a slow-moving, celestial current. The sadness, however, remained. It was a subtle ache, like a phantom limb, for a sky that was no more. For the familiar comfort of the known, for the certainty that Earth was home in your galaxy, not merely a speck in a cosmic embrace. Grandparents would whisper stories of the Milky Way, describing constellations that sounded like mythical beasts from forgotten lands. Young people listened politely, but their eyes were drawn to the fiery tendrils of Andromeda, to the strange luminous clouds that pulsed with an alien light. There was a rift, not of anger, but of understanding, between those who remembered and those who only knew this bewildering, beautiful immensity. Elara remembered. He remembered the nights of her childhood, lying on a blanket in her backyard in Ohio, counting the familiar stars, tracing the faint band of the Milky Way, feeling small but safe within its embrace. Now that embrace felt like a squeeze, a fusion that had dissolved her sense of belonging, yet also expanded it to an unbearable, beautiful degree. She worked in the city archives now, cataloging the digital remnants of the old sky, an ironic twist for someone who longed for what was lost. Her office, high in a repurposed skyscraper, offered a panoramic view of the night, a view that was simultaneously breathtaking and heart-wrenching. Tonight, the sky was particularly vivid. A stream of what they called Andromeda's veil, a particularly dense, glowing arm of the former galaxy, flowed like an ethereal river directly over the cityscape. It pulsed with hues of sapphire and amethyst, illuminating the streets below with a soft, otherworldly glow. The moon, often overshadowed by the blended galaxy's brilliance, was a pale, almost timid disk. Elara watched, her tea cooling beside her, the rhythmic hum of the city, a distant thrum beneath the vast silence of space. The initial shock had given way to resignation, then to a quiet, persistent contemplation. She saw the faces of commuters on the train, saw the way they paused, mid-stride, to gaze upwards, a shared silent ritual. In that shared gaze, a new understanding was slowly, painfully blossoming. It was a profound sense of interconnectedness, not just with each other, but with the very fabric of existence. The lines between what was here and what was out there had blurred, then vanished entirely. "It's not just stars, is it?" A young intern, a boy barely out of school, had asked her yesterday, his voice hushed. "It's everything, all of us, caught in it." Elara had simply nodded, a gentle smile playing on her lips. He understood. He understood the cyclical nature of existence that the ancients had only dreamt of. Galaxies were born, they lived, they collided, they merged, they gave birth to new stars and new possibilities. We, too, were part of that cycle, our lives mere blinks in the cosmic eye, yet infinitely significant in our capacity to witness, to feel, to mourn, and to adapt. The dystopia wasn't one of chains and scarcity, but of profound loss and an overwhelming, humbling truth. It was a truth that stripped away the illusion of human supremacy, replacing it with a quiet, persistent question: what now? And the answer, slowly emerging from the collective consciousness, was a continue. We learn to live within this new, grander narrative. 1. Elara thought of the ancient texts she sometimes came across in the archives, philosophical musings from centuries past, pondering permanence. What would they say now? Permanence was a whisper, a dream. The only constant was change, a cosmic dance of creation and destruction, of merging and becoming. Her own sadness for the Milky Way, the familiar anchor of her childhood, was still there, a soft thrum beneath her ribs. But tonight, looking up at the majestic, terrifying beauty of the blended galaxy, she felt something else too. She imagined the stars of Andromeda, once distant, alien suns, now sharing gravitational dances with her own sun's neighbors. She pictured the gas clouds mingling, the ancient stardust of two separate entities, now swirling as one. It was a love story, in a way, violent and beautiful, a testament to the universe's endless capacity for surprise. We hadn't been destroyed. We had been absorbed, transformed, given a new, infinitely larger home. A quiet, almost hopeful peace settled over her. It wasn't the boisterous optimism of a new dawn, but the deep, resonant calm of acceptance. The universe wasn't just happening to them, they were happening with it. Every breath, every beat of her heart was a tiny echo of that grand cosmic pulse. The universe wasn't ending, it was simply unfolding, and Elara, looking up, felt a profound privilege in being a witness to its endless, sorrowful, and undeniably magnificent story. The light from a billion new, blended stars streamed into her office, painting the walls with colors that defied human names. And for a moment, she was not just Elara, but a tiny, conscious part of the cosmic stream, flowing ever on.